Relational Lives are here again. Ali and Ros, we're here to talk today about the sexual cycle. We've talked in the past about the relationship cycle, haven't we? The relational cycle, Ali. But today we thought we'd really just get an overview of what it means to talk about the sexual cycle.
Yeah.
So please follow, like, subscribe, share, and perhaps even share with your partner, because you might find this really helpful.
Okay, let's dive into it then.
So what do we mean, Ali, by the sexual cycle?
Well, I suppose we've focused a lot, haven't we, on the emotional cycle that can come up in a relationship. It's very much something that's addressed in couples therapy, and the sexual cycle is really important to address too, because it can be, you know, if it's really powerful, it can be very damaging to the whole relationship. And it's a very crucial element of a lot of people's relationships. Not everyone, but for a lot of couples.
Yes, and I think you're right. Not everyone. And sometimes it's interesting, isn't it? Because the relational cycle can sometimes be fairly okay, actually. And then when we get into the sexual cycle, maybe there are things that aren't going so well. And sometimes it can be the other way around, that sometimes the sexual cycle actually is quite a healthy one and feels okay for both partners. But actually, when they get into the relational cycle, it's not so easy. And I think we should just remind people that we did a whole episode on the negative relational cycle last year now. And so,
yes,
you know, people can go back and perhaps maybe listen to that first. Might be a helpful thing to do to understand the language perhaps we use.
Good idea. Yeah, have a get. What was that one? What episode was that?
Oh, I can't remember, but we can put it in the show notes.
Okay, we'll put that in the show notes so that you know which episode to refer back to. So we talked in that one about pursuers and withdrawers, and how a pursuer is someone who is, or approacher is someone who is reaching for connection and closeness. And a withdrawer or a distancer is someone who tends to withdraw from that, often to protect themselves or the relationship. And the same thing can happen within the sexual cycle, can't it, Ros?
It can.
Yeah, sometimes if you're a pursuer in the emotional cycle, you might be a withdrawer in the sexual cycle, and vice versa.
Yes, which is interesting, isn't it? Because I think sometimes people might think they're going to take the same role, but actually it can be reversed.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of that dynamic, like you say, there's the sort of we were calling approacher, weren't we? The pursuer, the one who's perhaps really keen to get going, to want to have that intimacy. And the withdrawer perhaps struggling more, feeling perhaps more insecure for whatever reason, which we'll kind of look at different things that can go on in a bit.
Yeah.
But that dynamic can play out when it comes to intimacy and sex.
Absolutely, it can. So maybe if we start with, again, sort of just brief overview of how that cycle can look from an outsider, you know, from looking at it as a cycle, what we might hear from a couple in this particular dynamic, maybe starting again with the approacher, like the person that is wanting that closeness, wanting that physical intimacy, wanting that sensual contact, the one that is initiating, I suppose, wanting to initiate.
Yeah, I think there is that. That's a good word in a way. Initiating, if you think of pursuing, it's the person who's kind of heading in there, wanting to have that connection. And it can sometimes be, when we were talking earlier about the relational cycle can sometimes be the other way around. This can sometimes be a way that people who are sometimes withdrawers or distancers in their relational cycle can feel a connection. That's the way they want it, through the sort of intimate, physical, sexual contact.
Really good point. Really good point. Yeah. If you're someone who's, the distancer in the emotional side, you can be someone who actually really gets a lot of connection and closeness through that physical side, can't you?
Yes, and you kind of, you know, not just through emotionally, but also because those feelings that come up through all the chemicals that are going on when we have orgasm, and when we can feel that desire, can be a really lovely feeling.
The oxytocin is that closeness hormone, isn't it?
and can bring people feeling like they're more connected.
Yeah.
So a real contrast sometimes to what might be a disconnection in everyday kind of relational cycle stuff.
Yeah. And then there's the distancer in the sexual cycle, the person that's perhaps closing down from the side of the relationship, not wanting that, pulling away from that, rejecting the advances of the other.
And that can sometimes, if we link that back to the relational cycle, sometimes that can be people who feel that they're not, they're trying really hard in the relational cycle. They're being more of the pursuing, the approacher in the relational cycle because they're wanting an emotional connection. This is what people often talk about, isn't it, Alia?
That's
an
right.
emotional connection.
Yeah.
And then they can sometimes think that within the sexual cycle, well, you just want sex. You don't want to connect with me emotionally. Sort of in a way misunderstanding actually that often for the pursuer and the approacher within the sexual cycle that's the way they're getting the connection.
Yeah. It's a tough cycle, that's for sure, isn't it?
It is a tough cycle, and I think can also be something where when we've talked about cycles in previous episodes, they can be very established. And so it can feel very difficult to get out of that pattern.
Especially in a long-term relationship. If it's been going on a long time and that hasn't really been featuring as a big part of your relationship, it can actually feel quite awkward, can't it?
Yeah, and I think people do feel a bit uncomfortable, don't they? They find, and it's often a question we will ask when we see couples, are you okay about talking about sex and what's going on for you in terms of your sexual cycle?
Yeah.
And also, what can happen is that when it is difficult and when it is uncomfortable, there can be much longer periods of not having sex and of not being intimate, and that can create more distance.
Yeah. I don't think we can really talk about the sexual cycle without mentioning the idea of responsive desire versus spontaneous desire, because it definitely features as a part of this cycle, doesn't it?
Yes. And has been talked about by a lot of people, hasn't it? We can perhaps put something to help people understand that again in the show notes. And I think really key because, well, should we just explain a little bit about what our understanding of that is? So do you want to just sort of talk about the spontaneous desire?
Yeah, so spontaneous desire is when someone is very easily, naturally thinks about sex, wants sex, desires sex, without necessarily having to have a cue or a prompt for that desire to come alive. So perhaps they can even be fantasizing about it day to day, thinking about it day to day, and the arousal might come with that. The physiological arousal might come with that. Very commonly, again, this is more likely, I think, in males. Not always, but very commonly in males that comes more easily. And do you want to say about the responsive desire?
So where the spontaneous is a sort of very high response, isn't it? It's immediate in a way, isn't it? And what we're looking at in the responsive desire is somebody who perhaps doesn't necessarily have that immediacy of desire, immediacy of arousal, that they are wanting in a way to be warmed up. And that warmed up can not just be a physical warming up, so in terms of foreplay and things like that, but actually in terms of the emotional connection of having times where maybe having supper together and it's more romantic, or that they're being listened to and heard and understood before they feel they can then trust in the relationship to be able to go towards what can feel more vulnerable for them, to be more sexually connecting.
Yeah. So one is much more, easily thinking about it, easily aroused from thinking about it, and the other needs more cues, often, I think, to actually start that physiological arousal before the desire for sex even comes alive.
Yeah, I agree. And that can be not necessarily in the form of sexual cues.
No.
So I think, like what we're saying around that responsive desire, it's like, I want a different kind of response from you in order to feel like I can come closer to you and be more intimate with you. So for somebody, investing in time and space, as it were, giving somebody a feeling of being loved and cared for, and in whatever forms those are, like being understood and being available for people. We talk about this sometimes with EFT, emotionally focused therapy, don't we, Ali, about being available, responsive and engaged. And often I think those are the parts that for somebody who is the more responsive, desired sexual partner, those are the things that are quite key.
So I think what you're saying is that the warm-up, so that the desire comes alive, doesn't necessarily have to be sexual contact. The warming up for that can be loving contact, can be emotional connection, can be care. It's almost like the beginning stages of dating, isn't it, where that happens naturally in that process. And then when you get into a relationship, that obviously changes.
Yeah. And, I think that it is different for different people. And I think what we want to look at is this word, I suppose, intimacy, isn't it? And intimacy isn't just about the physical, it's about the emotional as well. And how do people feel into that intimate space, and what do they need in that intimate space in order to be able to come together sexually?
And if someone's listening to this, I'm thinking about, couples that we work with and what we know about this topic. If someone is listening to this and thinking, hang on a minute, we have all that, we have all the love, all the care, but we just don't have sex. We just don't have that part of our relationship. Then I think there's an element of this where there are some relationships where there isn't that care and that emotional connection. And that's a big part of why the sex goes offline. And there are some relationships where there is a lot of that, yet the sex has still gone offline. It's like that sensual, sexual element has kind of died down. Like the spark has gone.
That's what people sometimes say, isn't it? The spark has gone.
And it needs to be lit. Or the pilot light's there and it needs to be ignited,
Yeah. Do we need to talk a little bit more about the cycle and how that shows up in terms of linking that into the spontaneous and responsive?
Yeah, probably.
It might be helpful, I think, just to do a pattern of that.
Yeah.
And then we can go on and look at where that comes from, maybe.
Yeah.
Like we've done with previous cycles.
Go on then, Ross. I'll leave that one to you. Linking it in.
So if we've got somebody if we're starting from the person who is wanting, let's start this time from the person who's wanting more emotional connection, because I think often we do start from the person who's pursuing. And I think that we can link them both, but let's see anyway if this works out.
Okay.
So for the person who is wanting more of a warm up, who's wanting to engage more emotionally prior to having sexual contact, so they might be sort of in a way wanting to have that contact in their relational cycle, and they'll be pursuing more in their relational cycle. And when they're not getting that, then it brings in a more withdrawal, perhaps a more closing down response to any thoughts or any actions from the partner around sex or physical contact sexually. And so we talk often about the inside and the outside, don't we? So on the inside, the person who is wanting that emotional connection is possibly feeling misunderstood, feeling alone, feeling like their partner just only wants them for sex.
Yeah.
Doesn't really want to connect with them emotionally.
Yeah.
So all those sorts of things I think can go on in the inside. And so as a result of not getting that, their withdrawal on the outside, they're sort of saying, no, I don't want, I'm too tired, or I'm not up for it tonight, or just not really feeling it sexually, can then come down to the inside of the more pursuing, approaching partner. Do you want to carry it on, or shall I carry on?
Yeah. So, okay. So the person that's approaching for sex or wanting sex more is then feeling rejected, not good enough, questioning themselves often. Is it me that she doesn't want? Is it me that he doesn't want? They don't want? You know, it starts to become sometimes personal. Am I getting it wrong? Are they attracted to someone else? Lots of questions can come up within that, can't it? About what this is, what's happening here. Why is this not here? But also, this person might be feeling that's where I get my emotional connection. I need this sexual part of our life to feel emotionally connected to you in order to then be able to give you what you need.
Yeah.
And that's the really hard part of this cycle.
And also, I think, just to add in there, to feel emotionally connected with themselves. Because sometimes I think we can perhaps numb out more in our relational cycle. And so when we get the endorphins and everything that come with the physical, sexual element, that we can feel more alive.
Well, that's such a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Having that sexual energy, that sexual connection kind of brings that spark inside alive as well, doesn't it? Okay, I'm alive. I can feel again. I can feel close to you. I can feel in myself. I feel good.
And then on the outside, what will that then look like for the person who's going for sort of the more spontaneous desire?
You know, it can take many forms, I think. It may take the form of making hints about wanting sex. It could take the form of physical contact. You know, sometimes people can become very tentative and wary about how they initiate that sexual contact. So it might be a little pinch on the bum, or a subtle comment, or an innuendo. Or it could be more obvious than that, just grabbing them and, you know, come on, let's go and have sex. It can take so many different shapes, I think. What do you think, Ros?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But I think that the theme of all of them on the whole is going to be some kind of either initiation or pursuit. And I think that's the way it can come across then. So if you think of what you're describing as those many ways, perhaps with that experience of pursuing, of trying that have that physical intimate connection, that then for the partner who's needing sort of more, who's more of the withdrawer, perhaps the distancer in the sexual cycle, and wants more responsive desire, or is more led by responsive desire, as it were, that they can then feel that they're not being heard or understood. They're feeling pressured maybe, and that can then, in a way, from the outside of them, that can look like, no, again, more rejecting. And here we get into the more. So the more the person wants to have physical contact, sexual contact, the more that can feel too much for the person who's wanting to have more emotional connection. The more they can shut down and withdraw. The more they withdraw, the more the person who wants to have that physical connection is feeling more rejected. The more the rejected they feel, the more they try.
And the more alone they both feel.
And the more alone and more disconnected. And I think that's the key word with the cycle, whether it be relational or sexual, is that the result of a negative cycle, which is what we're describing, is disconnection, leading to loneliness, isolation, not reaching towards, going away.
Yes.
In some form.
Okay. So we've described this cycle, approacher, distancer, that infinity loop of how that gets stronger and stronger and more distant from each other. Perhaps let's talk about where it comes from. We've spoken about the different kinds of desire responses, which is a part of that. But there can be many other aspects of someone's individual experience that comes into this too, can't there?
There can. And I think what might be worth just considering with this is, which we've talked about in previous episodes as well, is attachment styles. I think that can be something that's, the way, because remember, we're talking about a negative cycle, but there's also people who don't have a negative cycle who might feel very secure, who feel like they're able to talk about any difficulties that are going on, or to be able to experiment and be curious, and all those things that come with feeling secure.
Yeah.
And so in a way, what we're talking about potentially is the more insecure attachment styles that can come into the cycle.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you're saying, you're giving people a flavor of how it can be different if you're feeling secure, and you can talk about it, and you can talk about what you want and what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Like, again, it's being that team together, isn't it? Let's look at this together as a problem that we can figure out.
Absolutely. And again, taking each person's part in that, and what I do when we're going towards intimacy, what is it that I'm doing? What is it that's impacting you?
Yeah.
Why am I doing that? Where is this coming from? And sort of really starting to have an inquiry. And that, I think, can link into our attachment styles, are the things that we have learned about sex growing up, the things that we have heard through the media, the things that we have experienced at school with different peer pressures or relational pressures. And I'm thinking also with youngsters now, with all this information and experience of the manosphere and how that's impacting porn, how porn has kind of been a part. So I think there are so many different things that can impact how we feel about ourselves, and then how we are and how we approach sex.
Yeah. And if you've had sexual trauma, this is going to have a huge impact on the sexual cycle, and how comfortable you feel in even talking about it, and the shame that you might feel around that, and how your body responds to sexual touch because of that, and this is something that's a very, probably a whole topic in us itself that we perhaps could cover, Ros, because it's a very sensitive topic, and I don't want to go into it too much here, but it's very relevant.
It is very relevant, and so we don't want to discount it, but at the same time, like you say, I think perhaps an episode and giving it its due attention within that. So we're talking more here about a sexual cycle where perhaps that might be a part of it, but where we're not thinking about that so much today, maybe.
Yeah.
Just to keep people safe as well.
Yeah.
People who have experienced sexual trauma, be mindful.
Yes. Yeah. Be very mindful, and we recognize that and how much impact that can have. And I think it's important we do an episode to explore that a little bit more.
So I think we've covered kind of what can happen in the cycle. We're starting to look at, a little bit more into where these things can come from. And I think there are so many influences that can impact how we feel. It can be, for instance, that maybe there was somebody who was kind of pretty secure in a relationship, and then there may have been an infidelity.
Yeah.
And so a breakdown in trust can change things.
Yeah. How you feel about your body.
Yeah. Body
can
image.
have a big impact, because obviously, you're exposing your body when you're big sexual.
It can be very vulnerable, can't it, in that respect?
If you don't have a good relationship with your body and your body image, that's going to have a huge impact on how safe you feel.
Yeah. So this, of course, is going to be all part of the sexual cycle, isn't it? In the same way that it can also impact the relational cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess it's really looking at what do people, how can people help themselves with this? Because it's a big subject in a way, and it might be that perhaps we can break it down a little bit more into different episodes, because it feels like this is big, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is really just scratching the surface. It's just maybe getting people to start thinking about it. And I think that's a key point, isn't it? That actually what we often say to people, to couples, is let's look at the cycle and look at what that dynamic is.
Yes.
How is it when you have, or when, actually, I think probably the question almost is when you had difficulties coming together sexually last time, even if that was 5 years ago, what did that look like?
Yes.
What does that look like when you have difficulties? Not necessarily always when it goes well.
What was the experience for you? What did you tell yourself that meant about you? What did you tell yourself that meant about your partner and the relationship? And what did you do with that? Did you speak about it? Did you close down? Did you go along with it? Did you comply? You know, there's a lot that can happen in that, isn't there?
There is. And I think what we're talking about is very simply what's going on the inside, what you're thinking and what you're feeling on the inside, and how that's playing out in what you do. And it's noticing also what is the thing that activates that. What do you see or hear or experience that then activates something inside, usually with an element of how we feel in our physical bodies, as well as what we're feeling and thinking. And then what is it we then do? And how does that then impact our partner? What are they then feeling on the inside, thinking on the inside? What do they experience and what do they see from that response that then means that they behave in the way they do?
So you each have a responsibility here to look at yourselves as individuals, reflect on your own experience within this so that you can come together, excuse the pun. And
yeah, I know. I noticed I said that earlier actually as well. It's great though, isn't it? Coming together in every which way.
and share that. I mean, even that, right? This come together thing.
Yeah.
The movies we see, porn, we're going to have had messages everywhere about what sex should look like.
Yeah.
How it's supposed to be, how often you're supposed to have it, when you're supposed to orgasm, how you're supposed to orgasm.
Yeah.
There's so many influences to this.
And those expectations as well, those expectations that have perhaps been set up, the modelling that might have been set up, all those elements that you've described. And then what happens inside. So I think often there's this real misnomer for men around maintaining an erection. And what it means, you know, around orgasm and all that sort of thing. And I know there can be a lot of issues for men as a result of the mental pressures that can be put on to perform. And what it means then if their partner doesn't orgasm, or what if it's that they have premature ejaculation, or there's so many elements that can put on extra pressures through expectations and societal pressures.
Yeah. Gosh, there's loads for us to cover here, isn't there? So we will definitely pick some little elements of this and flesh them out in other episodes.
Absolutely. And also, I think this is a really good opportunity to invite people to say what they would like us to talk about more in respect to anything, actually, but in this episode, in respect to sex and sexual cycles.
Yeah, we'd love to hear more from you if you're listening. So really what we're saying today is very much like in our other episodes around the relational cycles, is get to know your cycle. Get to know what happens for you in the cycle and what you do with that and how that impacts your partner, and talk about it together. This is the first step, is that awareness of it before you can change anything.
And I think that once people get to understand their cycle and how that plays out, it does lead to the possibility of more conversations about something that feels difficult to talk about. And that in itself will bring more connection.
Yeah. And, if you are a couple that are thinking, oh my God, we never talk about this, it's going to be so awkward. Maybe just have a conversation about that. Like, we don't talk about sex. And I'd like to be able to talk about it. How can we make it easier for that to happen?
What kind of gets in the way of having that conversation? What do we do? How do we respond? Do we walk away from it? Do we try and keep it going, but not in a way that's very helpful?
Do we make a joke about it? Do we?
Yeah, humour.
Make light of it?
There's so much. I was just thinking, just going through my head, just as we're talking about it, thinking of all the things that can impact somebody's intimacy and sexual contact. There's also health. There's times, with anything that, prostate, any cancer that can happen, and there's physiological things that can change a relationship, as well as age, menopause. Yeah. There's so many things that can kind of impact. And I think this is why so much needs to be talked about and understood and figured out. And if if people do this together, they can feel like they're not so in the dark. They can feel less alone, less helpless, and more connected.
Definitely. And from that can come wonderful things.
So I think we could, like you say, Ali, do another episode or more on different elements of this, because I mean, I don't know about you, but my brain is pinging with thoughts about things that we could bring in, and I don't want to sort of overdo it here, because I think we've given a sort of nice understanding of the sexual cycle, what can happen, how it can be different to the relational cycle, how people can start communicating. It's a funny word to use, but it is about communicating, but differently to just solution finding. To understand and to connect and be available for each other in a different way.
Yeah, brilliant. Love that. All right. Thank you again for listening or watching, everyone. Do stay tuned, and please do share our episodes with people that you know or you think might find this helpful. And subscribe and like as usual. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you, Roz.
Thank you, Ali.